Perfect.
Awesome. Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you again, James and Jojo, for putting this whole thing together. I don't know about smart guy. I am a academic by training. So I've had a lab at Rice for 10 years and then decided we took the tech as far as I thought we could in the academic setting and decided to start a company. Whether that is smart, TBD. So this is my foray into entrepreneurship. We're starting a company called Motif Neurotech. And there's a couple of questions that I think about, that motivate the work that we do. The first is that, yes, what am I doing wrong?
Hide the, oh, you can't. Never mind. You can live with that.
Can you live with this? Okay, hopefully. Yeah, so the first question that we think about is the fact that 1 in 10 Americans suffer from a mental health condition that's not effectively treated by their drugs. Sometimes it's because the drugs don't work well. For some indications, we really don't have effective drugs at all. And the technology that we're developing is designed to make it so that we can provide long-term treatment and long-term monitoring for these conditions. So not just to help people get better, but also to help them understand when they might need extra help. And we heard a lot of this about this from Helen this morning. And so I think it's really great to see more of this emphasis on mental health coming into this neurotech community. Now, to understand why I think this is so critical and who are the patients that we're beginning to look for to help, I think it's important to think about it from the patient's perspective. So when we think about some of these mental health conditions that don't respond to drugs, one of the first things that we've been looking at is treatment-resistant depression. So as Amy asked this morning, like, what is treatment-resistant depression? It's depression that doesn't respond to 2 or more drugs of adequate dose and duration. So people have tried drugs and they're not responding to it. And if you look at them and talk to them and look at their journey, it's quite dramatic. So over the course of decades, many of these people go through these cycles where they fall into a depressive state. They might get some help, they get better, and they relapse again. In fact, 42% of people who suffer from major depressive disorder are going to relapse. Each time you relapse, the chance of relapsing again increases by 16%. So we talked to people like Tyler, who at one point went through 27 courses of electroconvulsive therapy in 1 year. 27 times going under general anesthesia and having an electric shock induce a seizure. He got to the point, he was hospitalized many times with suicidal ideation, that he got to the point where he said that this is just so painful, I can't bear it anymore. I was willing to do anything. And he's not alone. We've talked not just to the patients, but to their families. Kathy, who's married to someone with treatment-resistant depression, talks about how she would go to work each day, and then she would worry that when she would come home, he wouldn't be there. And that anxiety that she lived with day after day really led them to the point where they were out of options. They were looking for anything to help. And these people are not alone. This condition is unfortunately quite widespread. About 450,000 people a year don't respond to their drugs, suffer from treatment-resistant depression, and make a plan to kill themselves. And that's the group of people that we want to help. And we believe that we'll be able to help them with neuromodulation. And there is a hope. And there's hope coming from the fact that data from a variety of neuromodulation therapies are showing the ability to treat people with depression who do not respond to their drugs. Helen talked about it this morning with deep brain stimulation, but we're also seeing really fantastic data coming out of transcranial magnetic stimulation. TMS, as you guys probably know, is FDA approved, it's CMS reimbursed. The response and remission rates are good, not great, but good, meaning that about 60% of people respond and 30% of people go into remission after TMS. Now, the important thing is that if you are a responder, meaning that you have responded to TMS, the likelihood of responding again is very high, over 80%. And this tells us something that we probably already know, which is depression is a heterogeneous disorder. Some people respond to DBS, some people respond to TMS, some people respond to ketamine. But once we figure out who's a responder to TMS, it's just a matter of going in and stimulating the right part of the brain. We talked to Erin. Erin's another person with TRD, and she describes her experience after her first round of TMS. And she had struggled since a teenager in and out of depressive episodes. And after her first round of TMS, she was like, first time since being a kid, she felt like a normal human being. Unfortunately, for the vast majority of people who respond to TMS, they relapse within 11 months. So she also describes that moment where she struggled for 30 years with depression and then started to relapse. And she describes the exact spot where TMS might be losing its effect. And it was devastating because she thought she had a cure and it was beginning to fade away. She went on to do 4 more rounds of TMS and has continued to try to find a long-term solution. Now, to understand why I think this is really important, the TMS sessions themselves are about 20 minutes, but you have to go into the clinic 5 days a week for 6 weeks. So imagine you're like working, taking time off work, driving to the clinic 5 days a week for 6 weeks for a therapy that lasts about 11 months. Now, normally I just jump into the solution, but we're friends. We're going to talk about stuff, and Helen brought it up earlier. So I want to put an even finer point on what we're seeing in the data now from TMS. So Helen mentioned this idea of accelerated TMS. So like, what if we took like 3 months worth of TMS and compressed that into 5 days? It's actually 6 weeks. 6 weeks of TMS compressed into 5 days. It turns out that tends to work better. She mentioned this 80% efficacy, which I agree with is not exactly the way it should be measured. It's actually probably closer to 60, 70% efficacy, but it works. So after 5 days, we see really dramatic remission relative to the sham. These patients are getting 10 courses of TMS in the clinic every day for 5 days. So every hour they're sitting in that chair and they're getting TMS. Now, you have to really dig into the literature to unearth what I think is really an interesting fact. That is, if you look at their open label data, which actually was published prior to this sham control trial, you'll see that after 4 weeks, all of the patients relapsed. So after spending a week in the clinic, a month later, they were back to where they were started. Now, why didn't they see that in their sham control trial? Is because they changed their patient selection criteria. So they removed all people who had previously gone through TMS. So what that means is that as this therapy is on the market, we're going to see more and more people who we discover are TMS responders that then relapse. And they relapse faster and faster every time they go through a new therapy. So what do we need? We need a way to deliver TMS therapy in a way that lasts. That's what basically what we're developing at Motif. A miniature implantable is about the size of a pea that can be placed in the skull through a 20-minute outpatient procedure. There's no shaving of the head. You can go home that day. In fact, you can do this with sedation. You don't even need to go under general anesthesia. What this device does is basically a way to deliver this known effective therapy, essentially the stimulation of the same target that TMS goes after, but you can now do it in the comfort of your own home as soon as you come back from that therapy, from that surgical procedure. And so what it will look like for the patient is that they can now come home, they can put on a hat that connects to that battery-free implant, and provide that same effective therapy, not just for their first course, but for their second course, their third. They can stay on maintenance. They can basically go about living their life normally, but receive what we know as an effective therapy. And then what we're looking at going forward, and Helen talked about this earlier, is the importance of being able to measure neural data. So in addition to receiving the effective therapy, they'll be able to track their neural data. And at some point, not today, but at some point, we'll be able to turn that neural data into a biomarker. And we hope that some of the work that Helen's doing, we've heard a little bit about the importance of biomarkers today. The advantage of being able to have longitudinal recording of neural data across many populations is something that we've really never had before. And so by deploying these therapeutic devices and having this neural data, we'll be able to develop these critical biomarkers. And these biomarkers will do 2 things. One, it'll help patients track their response, right? So imagine you get, your app on your watch, and you can see, even though you might not be feeling better, your biomarkers are starting to improve, and that will help with motivation and compliance with the therapy. The second thing is that if you begin to relapse, you can get that alert early, and not just you, but your psychiatrist can get that alert, and it could be a life-saving response. Now, one of the advantages of kind of miniaturizing this is the fact that we're avoiding stereotactic neurosurgery. So we're turning this from something that requires functional neurosurgeons, of which there are only 250 in the United States, to something that can be done in an outpatient procedure and eventually in an ambulatory surgical center and performed by any of the 2,500 general neurosurgeons. Now, all of this is possible because we've been able to shrink devices. Take what was like a tin can with leads and turn it into something the size of a pea. That was the hard part. And what we spent about 8 years in my lab trying to figure out. It's the physics stuff. So I don't see a lot of physicists in the audience. So now I can make stuff up and you guys will believe me. So what we solved was wireless power transfer. When you make devices small, they do not receive energy very efficiently. This is true for inductive coupling. It's true for RF. It's even true for ultrasound. What we developed in my lab is a way to transfer energy by using a magnetic field that causes a vibration in these so-called magnetoelectric materials. You'll see that the power that we deliver is about 10x more than inductive coupling. We see really nice misalignment tolerance. And we can even have multiple devices at this place. Yeah, cool. So we can have multiple devices that are controlled independently from the same transmitter. So going from one device potentially to many devices, each about the size of a grain of rice. So the architecture behind these bioelectronic devices is quite different. You'll notice there are no implanted batteries. Our Gen 1 device is all off-the-shelf components, save for these two materials that provide that wireless power transfer. The tech has been developed over the course of several years in my lab with DARPA funding, NIH funding, and then about 1 year ago tomorrow, we founded the company. We've gone from proof of principle, deep brain stimulation with these kind of tiny implants in rodents to large animals. And then as of about a week ago, we began to get our first in-human data. I've been fortunate. So I mentioned I'm an academic, which means I don't know anything about building biomedical devices, but I know a lot of people, and those people know how to build biomedical devices. So I've been able to help surround myself with good folks who know how to do some of this work from companies like SetPoint, Boston Scientific, Medtronic. We're always looking for more talent. And so, my ask here today is that, if you know people who are interested in building crazy tech and want to help make people feel better and solve important problems in mental health, please send them my way. The other thing that I want to point out is that we have this kind of nice advantage that, I talked about how great the data that we're getting from TMS is, but it's not just for treatment-resistant depression. That happens to be out for the longest, but we also have data coming out for ADHD, PTSD, and Alzheimer's disease. And in each of these cases, we have TMS to help us identify the target, help us identify which patients are the right patients for this type of therapy, and to help us even get so far as to get FDA approval and work out some of the reimbursement issues. Once all that is worked out, we can then come in with a long-term implantable solution that can fit the patient's lifestyles in a way that TMS really never will, in my opinion. Sorry if there are TMS lovers out there. So that's the story. I think, there is a vision that mental health conditions broadly will be able to be treated in an outpatient 20-minute procedure. And I think there's glimmers of hope there for treatment-resistant depression and for many of those other indications down the line. So thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you very much, Jacob. Great presentation and real interesting opportunity. Who has a question for Jacob?
So it's really a great talk. So your electrodes are inside this box, and it's given how small the box is, the electrodes are small and really close to one another.
Yeah.
And so, and you're above the dura, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So how have you been, is that something that you need to design for?
Yeah. So it was hard. So two things happen when you're above the dura. So one is, as you mentioned, the geometry is important. And so we've gone through many different electrode configurations until we found one that reliably stimulated cortex from above the dura in a chronic pig model and in the intraoperative case. The second thing that's really important is that you need a lot of energy to do it. So current thresholds for epidural stimulation can be as high as 15 milliamp. So sourcing that kind of energy from a device this size was the real challenge, and why magnetoelectrics is the real differentiator that allows us to reach those high current levels despite the small size of the device. And so we have compliance currents up to 20 milliamp.
Jacob, can you compare both from a signal standpoint and really just from a market standpoint, your approach relatively minimally invasive versus a subcutaneous approach, for instance, Intercosmos pursuing. Any comment on relative strengths or weaknesses?
Yeah, so that's a loaded question, but I will take it. So subcutaneous and intercosmos. So what does subcutaneous mean in that context? In the context of intercosmos, they're drilling into the skull. So I think the idea of subcutaneous, we're drilling farther into the skull than they are. So there is a subtle difference there. I think that the real differentiator there is the fact that I described what kind of current thresholds we need when we're on the Dura.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question of how much current do you need when you're now 6 millimeters above the Dura and going through bone. I think it's going to be really challenging to reach those levels of effective simulation currents.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of the day, what I think is really important is efficacy. So I think when we see our clinical data, that's going to be the determinant. So I'm confident that based on what we're seeing now with how we're able to drive a motor threshold, like we're able to get well above motor threshold, that we'll be able to get really reliable, robust responses comparable to what we see in TMS. I'd be really curious to see how people are going to be able to do that without getting closer to the brain.
And that raises my next question is, once you're in there on the Dura, you're effectively a BCI. You're effectively a brain
Correct.
computer. You're how is that different just in terms of positioning and marketing and potential pipeline products?
Yeah, I have a lot to say about that. So it depends on how you define BCI. There is a definition of BCI, which we fall under, right? So we're connecting a computer essentially to the brain to drive a response. And now our response is a therapeutic effect. You could record from those same electrodes and think about controlling the end effector. So it is possible that we could go in that direction. The reason why we chose to go toward therapeutic applications is numerous, but one of them is that there are existing reimbursement codes and endpoints for clinical trials. A lot of the challenges that I think are going to face the BCI community that are working in neuroprosthetics don't apply to therapeutics. And that's why I think it was an entry point for us.
Okay. Any other questions for Jacob? All right. Well,